When I was growing up, it was thought intrinsically unfeminine to do mathematics. People made eyes at me anyway because I was called Dusa after Medusa, and they said, well, you can't turn us to stone. You couldn't be a woman and do mathematics. You know, I'd always had a great split in between sort of being a female and being a mathematician. I sort of was leading two lives for a long, long time. So it was very important at some point to begin to integrate that. One thing that I think that holds women back is their own expectations of what they should do, as well as what they think other people think they should do. When I met Gelfand, he showed me what mathematical intuition was. He had a completely different view of mathematics. It was really what I dreamt of. I mean, this was the first place I'd been where I thought mathematics was as I thought it should be.
If you had to choose main results that you prove in your life, what would you choose?
I think the thing I wrote on rational and ruled manifolds, it introduced symplectic geometry to topologists. I think it was one of the first papers that made people like Donaldson or Taubes think that symplectic geometry really had something to say about four-dimensional things. I would say it's an essential component of the geometry that's related to physics. I mean, obviously, Riemannian geometry is related to curvature and space-time relativity, but I think that symplectic geometry is right in there with energy-conserving flows. I mean, it's another essential ingredient. Of course, these days, it does have a very important role to play in string theory and these strange dualities and mirror symmetry and things which relate it to algebraic geometry on the other side. That's very fascinating. I think it's one of the core geometries.
You were born in London. You moved to Edinburgh at the age of 2, at the moment where your father had the prestigious position as the head of the Department of Animal Genetics. You were living in a kind of kibbutz, I would say, at Morton Hall, and with many people there. And I'm not sure that you were dining with your, having dinner with your parents. So how was it?
So we lived in Morton Hall from when I was 2 until when I was 7. And my mother was an architect in the civil service. So she had a job that was 5.5 days. They had to work from 9 to 5, and then she worked on Saturday mornings. So we were looked after by Irish nannies, and you know, we didn't always see our parents that much. I mean, I think some days because we were on my mother believed in rather strict sort of child-rearing things, so we went to bed very early, and it's not clear I would necessarily have seen her in the evening very much. On the other hand, we had wonderful weekends. And I remember Morton Hall as a time of freedom. You know, I loved, there was a gang of young kids there, and so I was the youngest, but we would run around. There were wonderful grounds, you know. There was a walled garden with a gardener and a wheelbarrow. I mean, it was just like Peter Rabbit stories. And there were these trees you could climb, and my sister was a leader of the children, and I was always tagging along behind, you know, sort of running behind them. But I remember I really enjoyed being there. The adults were not so happy in Morton Hall, but I think the children had a wonderful time. And then we moved to Blackett Place in Edinburgh when I was 7, which was a wonderful Georgian house built, it's called a cottage, but it really, by my standards today, it was quite grandiose with lots of rooms and very solid walls and high ceilings. And it was my mother, it was sort of bought for her because she was an architect and loved this house. But we always had dinner together, even though as a family we didn't really see each other much else at the time. But I would say we had dinner together and we talked around the dining room table. And, you know, there was some intellectual life there.
So you're very proud, I think, of your ancestors, not only of your parents.
Sure. Well, my father's family was not so distinguished as a family. I mean, my father's father was a tea planter in what's now Sri Lanka, and the rest of that branch of the family they were prosperous farmers, I think, but they weren't intellectual. So he was the first sort of intellectual. He never saw his family. He was very separated. So I had an aunt that I met twice in my life or something. My mother, though, was a completely different story. She comes from she grew up in London, but her family, through her mother's line and father's line, the Pember Reeves, he was well known. He was I have the copyright for the poems of William Pember Reeves. I think he was a politician in New Zealand, and my great-grandmother was one of the people involved in getting women to vote in the New Zealand Parliament in something like 1894, and that was the first place that women had to vote, actually. So they had come from a long, distinguished sort of, they were interested in politics, socialist politics. When they came to London, they were members of the Fabian Society, knew Beatrice Webb, Sidney Webb. My grandmother was a member of the Young Fabians, and then had this affair with H.G. Wells, which was really, at the time, was a big scandal, and it meant H.G. Wells had to leave the Fabian Society. You know, when I tell people about it now, they just think,
it was a love affair.
It was a love affair. Yeah, she got pregnant. I mean, it was very scandalous. I mean, they ran away. They ran away to the north of France when she was pregnant. But, you know, he had a wife. He liked he loved his family life. He didn't want to live in the north of France with somebody who couldn't cook. And my grandmother didn't want to cook, you know. So it was somehow somewhat doomed, this escapade. So she came back and married my grandfather and became, well, a society person. She wrote books. She did quite a lot of things, but she never had an independent career, because at that time it was very hard to have an independent career and be married. She was a very distinguished person, but I always felt never quite made as much of her life as she could have. But I have her name, so I always identified with her. My mother had great admiration for her and was completely uncritical about this business about her running away with H.G. Wells. I mean, that clearly was the sort of highest aspiration for a young woman. That was one of the models I had for what, if you wanted to be a young woman that people would pay attention to, you had to do something like that.
How would you describe yourself as a child? Were you shy, or determined, or arrogant, and how was it? So you were obviously precocious, intelligent. How was it perceived in your relations with other kids? Was it a plus? I mean, something where you were naturally a leader, or were you more isolated because of that?
Well, I think it was more of a negative. I mean, I didn't have very many friends. I always felt unpopular and that nobody liked me. I probably was horribly arrogant. It's hard for me to tell, but I suddenly wanted praise and was always looking for praise that would come, well, from my teachers and my mother, but possibly my father never paid attention, that kind of thing. I mean, he was just not aware, I would think. You see, what happened to me was, you said you skipped 3 years at school. I skipped 1 year at school, so I went into a different class, and there I did make a few friends. There was a time when I was very close to my father, and he was writing a book about philosophy, and he would talk to me about his ideas, and we would discuss. I was reading Bertrand Russell, and he gave me Freud to read. I mean, we were sort of discussing some of the ideas that went into his book, The Ethical Animal. But then, a little later, things turned darker in a way. There was there were these world crises when I thought that the world was going to blow up, and I turned rather against science because it was sort of the beginning of the 60s. It was the beginning of the time when people started questioning the value, because my father really believed in progress and the human mind could solve a lot of technological problems, and I sort of rebelled against all that. So I stopped really speaking to him very much. And I didn't speak to my mother very much either. So I didn't really speak to very many people.
You said in one interview that your father did not like or appreciate especially mathematics. So how in the world could you be attracted as a kid, because this is what you said in one interview, as a kid you were attracted to mathematics, was it? So mathematics is, I mean, for many people it's basically boring at the age of 8 or 10 or 15. You just learn arithmetics and just trigonometry and so on. And so how in the world could you guess that mathematics could be the key, or one key of understanding the world?
Well, you know, my grandfather on my mother's side, my mother's father studied mathematics, and he became a lawyer, but he loved mathematics. And I remember him teaching me the times table when I was 4, and I loved it. I mean, he showed me the symmetry of the multiplication table. I really loved arithmetic. You know, I mean, I had, you know, I liked doing my sums. I thought I was a very goody child. I liked doing things correctly. And then I happened to be well taught. I was very lucky when, as a teenager, that there was, because I went to a girls' school and the science teaching was very bad, but there was a very good math teacher who really understood mathematics, and she taught me Euclid's geometry and she taught me calculus. She showed us a parabola and she started talking about, you know, the slope of the tangent, and she asked me, you know, well, at x equals 2, what's the slope of the tangent? And I guessed 4. And she said, well, why do you think that? Because she'd just done at 1 that the slope was 2. And well, I said, well, there's always a rule. And what she immediately did was just derive that for me. So I could immediately see why, you know, she just got the formula for me. And then she started teaching the rest of the class. But the thing is that she really loved mathematics and understood it. And so I always knew there was beauty in mathematics. And in my mind, it wasn't so tainted with things like the atom bomb. It wasn't so responsible for the atom bomb and all these other things. So that was a safe haven in a way. And my mother, you see, she was an architect. That's a combination of painting and mathematics. So there was always a mathematical skill on that side of the family. And she liked mathematics, even though my father did. See, by that time, I didn't pay that amount of attention to what my father thought. I mean, to some extent, but if he didn't like it, perhaps I would like it. You know? My father ran these conferences on theoretical biology. He was way ahead of his time in many ways. And so he had in the late, well, it must have been the early 70s actually, conferences on the theory of biology. He knew René Thom, and they were in correspondence. He was interested in mathematics to the extent that he wanted to build the kind of biology that only now people can think of doing. So he did think that mathematics was very dry and boring. On the other hand, he understood that it had some importance. Yeah.
But if you had not become a mathematician, because you have several talents, obviously, so what would have you become?
Well, I think the only thing I really had other talent for was music, and I played the cello. I certainly could have gone to music school and taken the cello up professionally, but I don't think that my talent at music, I mean, there was a time when I was really wondering what on earth I could possibly do. And I went through, you know, I was very good at school. I could do most of the subjects, but they didn't really have anything that I felt I sort of resonated with, except possibly for music. But I didn't think my talent there was so great in a way. And mathematics was always something that I loved. I didn't really communicate with many people about it.
Would you describe the support that you felt and that you had from your entourage or especially from your parents when you decided to go to mathematics?
My mother always brought me up to think I would have a career. So I always thought I'd go to university and become some kind of academic, I suppose, because that was a career that was valued in my family. So there was never any lack of support for that.
But even for the choice of mathematics? I'm thinking about your father especially.
When I decided not to go to Cambridge and to stay in Edinburgh, he got the professor of mathematics at home and said, you know, a special daughter and sort of look after her, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, he was concerned to that extent. Mm-hmm. He might have preferred it if I'd done biology, but really he never tried to. I mean, he told me that he didn't like mathematics much, but that was more him sort of being provocative rather than saying that against my choice.
Your sister did studies in anthropology.
Right.
And so of course this is much closer to your father's interest. Did you feel any competition between her and you during your childhood or teenager?
Well, we didn't have much contact in a way, and we were rather emotionally separated from each other. And she only came to anthropology much later. She went to Cambridge and she studied with Leach, who was a great anthropologist, and then she became an anthropologist. I don't think she didn't go to Cambridge with the idea that she would become an anthropologist. Though, you know, the family knew Margaret Mead, and Margaret Mead had visited our house, and so, I mean, it was certainly a subject that was, but all academic subjects were okay, I think. I think if we wanted to do French or something, that might have been not considered so wonderful, but either anthropology or mathematics was fine.
So then you went to Cambridge, and
Right.
you spent a few years there, and you wrote, I mean, more or less, as I can understand, more or less on your own, a paper that solved a well-known conjecture in operator algebras. That was published in one of the 3 top journals in the world, Annals of Mathematics. And then just after that, during your studies at Cambridge, you decided to go to Russia. And by some random chance, you ended up to working with Gelfand. I think Gelfand liked you very much. I think the word like is an euphemism. And let me just cite one of the many sentences by Arnold about the difference between French and Russian mathematics. So Arnold used to say that the French mathematicians can go over hundreds and thousands of kilometers and to discover a valley, the sacred valley and the river, and then once they have done that, they go back. But the Russian mathematics do the same, and once they found the river, they go over the river and discover a huge land that they explore. What kind of mathematics did you discover when you worked with Gelfand, and how did this have? Because of course you had work in operator algebras, which is a subject which is deeply analytic and algebraic, and then suddenly you discover something completely different with Gelfand.
You see, when I went to Moscow, I knew incredibly little mathematics because I was an undergraduate at Edinburgh, and there I would say, you know, I studied the curriculum, but just the curriculum, and it was not very modern curriculum at that time. And when I went to Cambridge, graduate school in America is in Cambridge or Britain at the time was very specialized. So I just did operator algebra. So I didn't study anything else. So I worked on that for 2 years and, you know, solved this problem with von Neumann algebras. And I went to Moscow just for the reason that I was married to somebody who had to go because he was doing a PhD in Russian poetry and had to go to the archive. So I didn't go with any mathematical reason. Nobody had given me an idea that I had to actually think what I might do when I got there. I just thought, I was a very dutiful kind of person. I just sort of thought, well, I go there and I do whatever was expected of me. But nothing was expected of me when I got there. And by the luckiest chance, I had actually read some of Gelfand's works, which I'd read when I was at Edinburgh, in fact. And so I mentioned his name. I'd read some of his works about distributions. But when I met Gelfand, he was sort of interested in phenomenal algebras, but he was, there was just some very small part of what his view of mathematics. And so you say he taught me intuition. Well, you can't teach anybody intuition. He showed me what mathematical intuition was. I mean, I saw he had a completely different view of mathematics, the kind that was really what I dreamt of. I mean, this was the first place I'd been where I thought mathematics was as I thought it should be. Because otherwise, in Cambridge, I was just with this rather limited group, and there was no panorama, there was no vision of what you might do with mathematics. So, I learned a lot, I read a lot, because I was very ignorant when I went there. But really, it was just opening my eyes to a vision, I think, of a much broader view of what mathematics could be that was the important thing. And then I was only there for 6 months, and when I came back, I was working on my own, because more or less. So I did, Gelfand had told me to work with Adams, but Adams was only half at Cambridge at the time. So he gave some wonderful courses. So I went to some wonderful courses by Adams, but I didn't really talk to him, and he didn't offer me much guidance. So I was very isolated for a while.
You went to MIT, and then once again you felt, just before that, you felt really isolated also, but you had an ongoing collaboration with Siegel.
Yeah, well, that was the important thing that really got me back into being a functioning mathematician again. That, in fact, Cambridge, to its credit, I was talking to the chair, and he was saying, well, I really appreciate the work you were doing in von Neumann algebras, keep up the good work. And I said, well, I'm not doing that at all. I'm doing algebraic K-theory now. And he looked a bit taken aback and said, almost immediately, well, there's a conference in Seattle coming up, you've got to go. So he made sure I went, which was really very good of him, because that's where I met Graham Siegel, and those were the first personal contacts I made that allowed me to start talking to somebody again and start really becoming more of a mathematician, because you can't do mathematics in isolation, certainly when you're beginning. You have to be in a community, you have to know what the problems are, you have to you have to work with other people.
In between Russia and MIT, you had your first child, isn't it?
I had my first child and my first job, and I was also very busy, earning a living and that kind of thing.
First job at York.
First job at York. But then when I went to MIT, which I think I was invited there, because MIT was trying to encourage women, so they were looking around for possible women to invite, and probably they got a recommendation from Gelfand via Singer or something. So Gelfand certainly did his best to help my career, even though he was in Moscow and I couldn't see him very much. But there I realized, that I actually could do things to promote my own mathematics career. I could become more active. I didn't just have to do what was laid out in front of me. So that was another important turning point. I went to Bott's seminar, I went to lectures by Gilliman, but those interactions weren't quite so important, I think, as, for one thing, being in a very stimulating mathematical environment, so I could see how, the kind of mathematics that was being done and feel part of an environment where real mathematics was being created. And then I realized, I could apply to the Institute of Advanced Study. that everybody else was going, but I could go, which hadn't occurred to me before. Because, as I say, I was very dutiful, and I just there were many things I had no idea about.
You had this paper, a wonderful paper in Annals of Math. You were supported by Siegel, by Gelfand, And still, you needed to interact with female mathematicians at MIT to gain a kind of confidence. Could you explain this?
I mean, there's a whole aspect to being a female mathematician that certainly in those days, and I think still in these days, you can't just say it's all the same whether you're a male or a female. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things was that I had a second life. I was a mathematician, but I was a mother, I was a wife. And in those roles, I was very traditional. I did all the cooking. I did everything, actually. I did all the cooking. I did all the diaper changing. I did all the shopping. I did all the driving. I did all the earning money. I mean, I did everything because I was married to somebody who was a poet, and poets are just not very practical. And this particular poet was not capable of doing very many practical things. But I'd always had a great split in between sort of being a female and being a mathematician. I sort of was leading two lives for a long, long time. So it was very important at some point to begin to integrate that. And so I think meeting somebody, because there were a few women in Cambridge when I was a graduate student, but the women were very marginalized. I mean, exceptionally marginalized, or they were people who were doing PhD, but then they were going to get married, and then they were not going to continue with their career, and those people I sort of dismissed. I was looking for somebody who wanted to be a research mathematician, and the only person I knew who wanted to be a research mathematician was very marginalized. And then, there were no other women mathematicians. So the first person I met was Rangli Peony, who's been a good friend ever since. But she was I met her, of course, like 2 months before I had to leave. I mean, it always happens if you travel around, you meet somebody just as you're leaving. But, we gave her our VW car, and that was some kind of bond, and so we kept seeing her, and so I've known her for a long time. But I think it's actually incredibly important. It was very important to me to have somebody, because when I was young, you see, I didn't have any female friends. I didn't have friends at school. It was a short period of a year or two when I had some female friends, but then when I started having boyfriends, I cut myself off from them. And then I didn't have any female friends as a student or as a graduate student. So I had these days I think women wouldn't be so cut off. So they would know other young women that they would have as friends, and it would be more integrated. But for me, it wasn't.
Up to now, you had three lives. So the life in operator algebras, the one with Gelfand on foliations, and the one with Siegel on algebraic topology, let's say. And so these are three different fields that all three of them are hard. So it's really rare, I mean, to see a mathematician, a woman or a man, going through quickly three fields that are so demanding. So how where did you find the energy? I mean, the time, also because you said that you're doing everything at home. So where did you find the time to absorb the prerequisites for all these, and of course then to contribute originally in some original way to each of these fields?
What I did in operator algebras was, I didn't have a great depth of knowledge. That was one of the problems, that I solved a problem, but it was from a rather superficial viewpoint, and I didn't know where the field led. So I don't think that was one of the reasons I was so willing to switch fields when I got to Moscow, because I didn't have a depth of vision in that field. And my thesis supervisor, even though he was up to date and could show me recent research, didn't have that depth of vision either, so it hadn't been communicated to me. And with I don't think I did much in foliations. I did a little bit, but not much. And then with the work with Siegel, most of the ideas were his, though the guiding ideas, they were mostly his. And I did learn some techniques, and I suddenly helped prove a few theorems that actually I was very pleased to discover just a few months ago, people are still thinking about, and so they haven't been forgotten. Those ideas that we developed are still being sort of worked on by people about configuration spaces of positive and negative particles and things. When I went to MIT, there was this, Bill Thurston had been there the year before, and there'd been this theorem about well, he'd been talking about amoeba, but he was working with properties to do with the groups of diffeomorphisms and the classifying space for foliations. And that's when I was working on that with Graham, and then we sort of parted company, and I continued working in that field and sort of started making some questions my own, I would say. So it was really at that time, it was an offshoot of that I worked on volume preserving diffeomorphisms, with probably work that nobody cares about now, but it was sort of, I did it and I was sort of doing something independently, and then I started from volume preserving, well, what's the next thing but symplectic? And so that's what led me to symplectic geometry just about the time that the field was wakening up. So I knew Heffliger from the foliations work, and Heffliger had a student, Ben Yago, who'd written, sort of extended Thurston's work from the volume preserving to the symplectic case, and I read that, and I started doing little things in symplectic geometry, and then, well, the Arnold conjecture was proved for the torus, and, things, and Gromov produced his wonderful paper. I mean, things started livening up. So, I would say, for my mind, the field that I've made most contributions really is symplectic geometry, and that's a very rich field. I haven't really felt any need to leave it because it seems to encompass so much, so to speak.
Okay, so then you moved to Stony Brook, and and from Rutgers to Stony Brook, isn't it? Or?
I was at York for 4 years, and then I was at Warwick for 2 years.
Yes.
And then from Warwick, I moved to Stony Brook.
Stony Brook was one of these very new universities that was building, and that has this specific aspect that it was one of the best universities in the country, at least in geometry, but still a public university. And so if we accept, let's say, the Public University of California, this is an exception in the US. And so was this the fact that it was publicly funded and admitted a lot of students, not only just the very best students? Was it something that attracted you to Stony Brook, or was it simply the geometry group that made the job?
I mean, I wanted to move to the States for personal reasons. So I applied to all the universities that were moderately close to Princeton, and the only one that offered me a job was Stony Brook. So I went to Stony Brook. I went to Stony Brook sight unseen. I didn't know anybody there. I didn't know it particularly had a good geometry group. You give me too much freedom of choice and sort of control over my career at this point. I just went. I mean, I felt very lucky in the end to get to Stony Brook because it was a good place for me. It was lucky, I feel. And I certainly didn't object. I mean, I hardly was aware of the difference, because in Britain all universities are public universities. I was not really aware of the difference between private and public, so that had no influence on anything.
How would you describe the pleasure or the depth of that subject to a young student coming to your office and asking you, Dusa, please tell me, I want to do eventually a PhD with you. Tell me what is important in mathematics, and why should I do something in symplectic topology?
Well, I think, to begin with, I didn't appreciate this hard and soft thing. It was more that the techniques I'd been using in volume preserving geometry just didn't work. And so then the question was, could you find, because I was doing things where it was very important to control the support of certain symplectomorphisms, and so to have a subset of Euclidean space and know that there might be something preserving the symplectic structure that would take it onto another subset. And in volume preserving world, really there's a basic topological shape, and then there's the volume, which is sort of easy to control. That's all there is. And in symplectic geometry, there's many more invariants, which of course I had not much clue of, except that nothing obvious seemed to work. So it was, and then I started looking into the field. There seemed to be lots of open questions. It seemed to be a rewarding place where I could actually discover interesting techniques and also prove things. And then very shortly, Gromov introduced these J-holomorphic curve techniques and proved the non-squeezing theorem, which I've always found very attractive, because it's exactly answered this question I was trying to look at, moving things around in Euclidean space. Another thing, actually, I spent quite a bit of time in Princeton in those days, and Bill Thurston was and I was at IHES, and Benneker and people, they were developing ideas of contact geometry, very geometric ideas in low dimensions about contact geometry and hyperbolic geometry and what the invariants were. And I just found that aspect of it, that it was more geometric. I found that very attractive. And there were very good people working it at that time. It was an exciting field because things were happening. So that's what drew me to it. And then as things have developed these days, I think you're right. There are many different aspects to it. There are purely topological aspects. There are algebraic geometric aspects, there's connections with physics. It seems to be just a nexus for many, many different areas. It's a very important kind of geometry that people hadn't studied because they didn't have any tools for it, but it really is one of the basic kinds of geometry.
You had a beautiful relation with Dietmar Salamon, with whom you wrote 2 books. Mm-hmm. One, which is in some sense a book where it was a cleaning of mathematics needed to understand the basic concepts of symplectic topology, for example, quantum cohomology. And then a second book also called Introduction to Symplectic Topology. So what were your relations with Dietmar, and how did this project of these 2 books evolve?
They started probably in the late 80s when I was giving some lectures and thinking of writing up some lecture notes. And I heard that Dietmar at the time was in Warwick and he was thinking of writing up some lecture notes. So I immediately said, well, let's collaborate. I've actually done very little research with him because his interests are more analytic than mine. But we make a very good team, and we would argue about how to do things. But usually the result of the argument was that we put both points of view in, and then we'd have a bitter argument about whose point of view would go first. Do you put the formula first, which of course didn't say anything to me, but was what spoke to Dietmar, or do you put the sort of explanation first? And I think we compromised. I have gradually come to realize that sometimes formulas are helpful, and it really does clarify certain things to have formulas there. So I think it worked pretty well.
We worked together from more or less 1990 to 2004. And we work basically, most of the time, not always, but most of the time on what I call magmatic mathematics. That is, for example, the best example of this is Hofer's geometry, where there is a huge land to be explored and essentially nothing is known, so you just try to find some way inside it. Later after, you worked with Sue Tolman on things that are much more structural, that is on Toric geometry. So much more structural, much more constrained. Is there a reason to move from this magmatic world to something very structural at that moment in symplectic geometry? Because this is still what you're doing, more or less. You work in a world, so Toric geometry, which has strict rules, and which is not at all comparable, I would say, to Hofer's geometry, where you work in such a huge world where almost nothing is known.
I think the work on toric geometry is quite combinatorial, and that is a rather specialized thing. I think I learnt a lot from working in that area, but it's not. I don't quite see its connection so much with the outward world, which I think it has, but I'm not so aware of that. The more recent things I've done about elliptic embeddings, in a way, they're constrained, but they're using gauge theory. They're a little bit different in the sense that I have more sense of how they connect to other parts of mathematics. And then when I was doing the work with Hofer geometry with you see, I probably viewed it a little bit differently from you, and you may have seen all this vast chaotic world that had nothing there, and I was really looking at, again, I was very focused on the non-squeezing theorem, and in fact most of our proofs were built on cunning uses of this theorem, right, and how you could use it to give you some information. Again, very focused on in a way, rather concrete techniques that would give us some results.
So if you had to choose a few, let's say 3, or it could be 2, 3, or 4, main results that you prove in your life, not only, for their importance, but also for whatever distinguish them from anything else, what would you choose?
Well, there are 2 early papers of mine I wrote in symplectic geometry that I like a lot. There's the one where I did examples of symplectic structures, which was using Gromov's new ideas in a sort of interesting way. And then I think the thing I wrote on rational and ruled manifolds, even though I thought it was a bit of an afterthought, was actually very important because it introduced symplectic geometry to topologists, and it made people who are interested in low-dimensional topology realize that a symplectic structure had something to say in that area. So it was really I think it was one of the first papers that made people like Donaldson or Taubes think that symplectic geometry really had something to say about 4-dimensional things. So that was very important, and probably, I've had people say, "Oh, I've been using your theorem," and I think, "Well, which theorem?" But they, my theorem is that one about rational and ruled manifolds. And then since then, I wouldn't say that anything I did earlier, of course, the thing I did on von Neumann algebra was very important to me personally because it was somehow proof that I could do mathematics. But it's hard for me to pick. I liked our paper, The Geometry of Symplectic Energy. I liked that one. I like the title. I think it's a great title. And I like the work I've been doing about ellipsoids, which has relations to, it's not just about embedding ellipsoids, it has all kinds of relations to the variational side of symplectic geometry and other aspects of it.
So there is this kind of evolution where we go from geometry and to kind of naive geometric ideas to very technical aspects. So, of course, you have been through all this, but as far as I can see, you have always kept the first step that is in your life. You have a bit contributed to the analytic aspect in a paper about range manifolds. But how do you see this evolution? Do you think that it is completely normal? And how do you see yourself in this evolution?
Well, for one thing, I would say, I've written this recent long paper with Katrine Verheim about the fundamental foundations of Kuranishi structures. So I'm very involved, actually, in this sort of technicalities, even though my contribution was not analytic, but more topological. There seemed to be a lot of basic topological issues to be worked out, which I think are very interesting, and I think it's very important for the field to get these correct, because partly the field is so close to physics, and there are so many wonderful ideas coming from physics that without a grounding of, I mean, it's very easy to be careless. It's really hard to get things precise, and sometimes you really need new ways of looking at things, and people just haven't been careful enough. So I think it's actually very important to try and get the foundations issues correct, and there's definitely Hofer-Vysotsky-Zander is one way, and I think the old methods, which are still another possibility, that one can make the old ways of doing this correct, but it still requires some work to polish the proofs, though perhaps the basic ideas are there, but the proofs are definitely not polished yet, and I think the field deserves to have correct proofs that you know, are not just approximately right. Then the third aspect, all this algebraization and A-infinity categories and mirror symmetry, I would say is very exciting, but it's not clear it's for me. I mean, I don't have enough knowledge really to contribute in that area. I'm more interested, I think those ideas have something to say about specific geometric questions. And so, for example, I'm interested, you have this Lagrangian torus, can you displace it from itself? Is there a Hamiltonian isotopy that moves it off itself? That I find an interesting question, and I've made a few contributions there. But the other way of trying to find invariance to show that it can't be displaced, that has many repercussions, and I only understand a little bit of that. That's why I say symplectic topology is incredibly rich, because there are many different aspects. I mean, there's a dynamical aspect. You can, you know, there's just many different aspects of it. And it's too big for me to know all of it.
There seems to be a kind of convergence of many ideas and people that met and methods at this, more or less at the same time in this end of the 60s, during the 70s. So we can think of Arnold, Gromov, Elie Ashberg, in the United States, Alan Weinstein, Thurston. So people and methods were ready to found, in some sense, symplectic geometry, isn't it? And how did you benefit from that convergence?
You know, I was aware of some of the debates because at MIT, when I was there, Bill Thurston was just there, and people were still trying to understand his ideas. And then I spent some time in Princeton afterwards, and he was there doing a lot of hyperbolic geometry, but still always alive with lots of geometric questions. And people were trying to solve elementary questions about contact geometry. So I was more aware of that, the sort of the geometric side of the questions at that time. But there were also Alan Weinstein. I mean, there were people interested in periodic orbits, trying to find periodic orbits for Hamiltonian flows. And there were new advances in critical point theory and convex geometry that led people to find new methods of proving the existence of critical points. So that was something completely out of what I knew, but it did really come together. I would say the main influence at the beginning of the 70s, that there were these developments as a proof of the Arnold conjecture by Conley and Zander, and then Gromov's paper about J-holomorphic curves, which in some sense, certainly for me, came out of left field. This was a totally new idea. I think it was a completely new idea, but it had something to say. So, and then, well, Fleur sort of put things together. I mean, the variational point of view together with this complex geometry, and really, in retrospect, I mean, that was an incredibly important formulation of ideas in symplectic geometry that's led very far. And there were many people who contributed. Viterbo contributed. He proved that there were several conjectures that people had, which seemed rather innocent. Like if you have a hypersurface in Euclidean, an even-dimensional Euclidean space, does it have a closed periodic orbit? That's one question. And the other one was the existence of fixed points as symplectomorphisms. They were sort of motivating questions at that time, and people devised brilliant ideas to try and solve them.
One needs many prerequisites. So one needs to understand algebraic geometry, algebraic topology, analysis, and topological geometry, of course. So PDEs, so many things. And so the subject is out of reach for many people because it requires so much knowledge of mathematics. I think that you had exactly the right knowledge at that moment to enter the field.
Well, you know, the many things I was completely ignorant of, and so I was learning as I went along. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I knew no algebraic geometry. I knew very little of four-dimensional topology. Mm-hmm. So when I proved this result about rational and ruled manifolds, I only learnt what those words were after I proved the result, so to speak. You know, I mean, I've always felt I've had a great lack of background, that I just haven't known things. I have learnt subsequently that many people feel that way.
Tell us about the period at Warwick. So there was, I think there was Zeeman, whom your father knew, and other people that had, I think, quite an influence on your career.
Yeah, well, I'd like to tell you about an incident I don't know that many people know about, but it was after I'd just finished my undergraduate and was going to Cambridge, and there was a conference in Edinburgh, and Chris Zeeman was there. And we happened to be in a movie sitting together in the cinema, and he didn't know who I was. And so we started talking. And once I'd sort of, you know, I felt he sort of liked me and he appreciated what I had to say, and then he asked me what I was doing, and I said, well, I'm going to Cambridge to go to a PhD in mathematics, and he asked me who I was going to study with, because at that time you had to decide who you were given a thesis advisor, and I told him this person, and he said, oh, that's a terrible, you know, he's peopled Britain with these boring mathematicians. And I told him who I was, because at that time I trusted him well enough for him to say, well, you know my father, you know, I'm Wad's daughter. And he was quite amazed, because of course he knew my father very well, and that's why he was in Edinburgh. And anyway, he made sure I got somebody else as a supervisor. And I think that was probably very lucky for me, that I had George Reed as my supervisor, because he put me onto an interesting part of mathematics and things. And, you know, I didn't meet Chris Zeeman very much, but he may, though I don't know this, he may have had a hand in me getting a job at Warwick, because it was an open position. I applied for it. And, you know, at that time my resume didn't look very good, because I'd spent many years not writing any papers, and I'd completely switched fields, and, you know, I mean, it was a bit of a chance. I was certainly not somebody with, you know, a sort of ongoing research program with lots of papers to my credit at that point. So anyway, I went to Warwick, and that was a wonderful university, because it was run more on American lines, or there was a little research institute there. There were these research houses that Christopher Zeeman himself had designed, so they were mathematicians' paradises. So they had a little house for the family, and then there was a little hallway, and then at the back there was this round study that was sort of sealed. You could seal the door. The walls were blackboards all the way around, and your mathematician could sit there in splendor and do mathematics. So that was, everybody liked that. Right? And he won an architecture award for it. And actually, another thing about Zeeman, he was, I think, one of the first people to realize that the buildings influenced the way people interacted. Well, I mean, that can't be true, but in the mathematics world, he specially designed the mathematics department at Warwick so that the mailboxes were in the common room, so everybody went to the common room. It was a very social environment. And, you know, that's been copied a lot since then. But the Warwick Common Room was pretty famous.
I've always had the impression that you had a very strong personality, but you hide it somehow, and with a lot of kindness. Did you change so much from the age of, let's say, 7 or 8 or 10 and until now? Because I suppose that you gained confidence quite a lot.
Well, I don't think as a young girl I lacked confidence. I think I was very confident until I was about 14. I mean, you know, adolescent girls go through difficult times. So I think at that age, I sort of completely switched, because I'd been very, very successful and was always looking for praise and always wanted to get 100 in every exam. You know, I must have been very obnoxious. I mean, for people not liking me, it's probably perfectly reasonable why they didn't like me. And I started thinking, well, that's not the way to be. At that point, I started not talking to people. I had 1 or 2 very close friends, but I didn't talk to adults. And as a mathematician, I think I was shy. I wasn't shy as an undergraduate, because then it was a little bit more like school, and I was fine. And perhaps until the time, it may have been going to Moscow and realizing that I knew nothing, and that the world of mathematics was much bigger than I'd thought. That it really was another time when I sort of became very shy mathematically, and I felt I was very ignorant and everybody else knew everything, which I'm sure is not true. But if you're not talking to people, how do you know that? So then it took a long time. I think by now I've learned to cope. And you know, with Dietmar, you have to learn to deal with him, or you can't collaborate with him. Most people these days think I'm very talkative and very sociable, and I try and be that way, because I think it's better to speak to people than not to speak to people.
So you had very early to escape Great Britain to Russia and then also to United States. Did you find that at that moment, at least, mathematics in Great Britain were not as developed, or maybe not as viewed as important as physics, chemistry, experimental sciences?
Well, I didn't have a big, broad picture of it like that. I think when I went to Cambridge, the group I was associated with was rather narrow and inward-looking, didn't have a vision. And I discovered people with a vision when I went to Moscow. But, you know, gradually, that was the particular group in Cambridge I was associated with. I mean, by the time I was in Warwick and had been working with Graham Siegel, he was in Oxford. I mean, there were certainly people I was getting in touch with who were doing wonderful mathematics. And I didn't go to America. I went for personal reasons. I didn't go for mathematical reasons. It was nothing to do with the way mathematics was viewed that made me leave Britain. And actually, Warwick I felt that was a good place for me. That it was somewhat like Stony Brook.
You have worked for women in mathematics or in sciences more generally for many years now. You have been very much involved, giving talks and working and for them and trying to find positions for them. So I was a university research fellow when I finished my postdoc at the IHES, and then just after that I was nominated on a committee at NSERC. NSERC is the Canadian equivalent of NSF. And to be member of the selection committee of the first committee that would allocate awards, women faculty awards, to have a tenure track position in a given university. So this was reserved to women. So 20 years later, NSERC made a complete review of that program and came to the conclusion that that program was a failure. That is, it had not changed the structure of or the number of women in mathematics. However, I strongly believe that the most powerful action to be taken, and actually you raised that point earlier in this interview, is to change the civil way of living, that is a society, that is to have paternity leaves, not only maternity leaves, to have to share the task, changing diapers and so on. Mm-hmm. So once this is done, I mean, most of the primacy rule is solved, more or less, I think. So what do you really think that in 2012, mathematical institutes or departments or associations should still have the same kind of affirmative action as before?
Society has to change, but that's very slow, and certainly in America it's not, there isn't much support for paternity leaves. I mean, we don't even get maternity leaves. I mean, there's no support in society for organizing that kind of thing. I think
we have in Canada. We have.
Yeah, I mean, it's better in Europe, but you certainly, I think, in the States, that's no go. I mean, you can certainly work towards making childcare more accessible and more affordable, and that helps somehow. Actually, I think there's still quite a bit of prejudice against women in mathematics. I still think there's still that women feel unwelcome, and that their achievements are. I mean, I think they're viewed a little differently. I think women are always questioned. You know, are they any good? And do they meet, you know, are they good enough somehow? For me personally, I think that going to MIT, which I only did because it was an affirmative action line, was enormously important. And I think there are ways that you can promote women that are helpful. I don't know how that program was evaluated in Canada, but certainly in the States, there are many more women now in mathematics than there were. And the women are much more visible. Actually, a lot of those women are women, interestingly, who've come from Europe or other places and have built a career in the States, partly because, you see, one thing that I think that holds women back is their own expectations of what they should do, as well as what they think other people think they should do. And if you come from Turkey to America, you don't understand all the things that American society is saying you should do.
The subtext.
The subtext. You're not aware of those, and you're free from all the things that you know your own society is telling you should do. So you're free to build something. So I think I think there's a huge amount of unacknowledged thoughts about what women should be. You know, when I was growing up, it was thought intrinsically unfeminine to do mathematics. So if you were, you know, people made eyes at me anyway because I was called Dusa after Medusa, and they said, well, you can't turn us to stone. If I say I was a mathematician as well, that would be equivalent, right? I mean, women, you couldn't be a woman and do mathematics. You know, I don't think that kind of attitude dies away immediately. People saying it's ridiculous, I think it's actually quite prevalent. I think that women have to overcome that. And the only way to do that is to have more women and different kinds of women. And so I don't really know that many young women well enough to know exactly how they experience being a woman mathematician. But I still think it's very hard. Partly for the reason that it doesn't fit together with having a family and because it is genuinely hard to have young children and do mathematics, because you're thinking about such different things. It's hard if you're doing mathematics to take time off. You know, it's hard to take a year off and come back really focused. I think it's hard, and the fact is there really aren't all that many young women, and it makes a huge difference when there are more. So I think, for example, at MSRI there was a program I was involved with recently, and if we hadn't made an effort, there would have been rather few people there, women there. But we did make an effort, and we got a wonderful group of young women there. And so when you were in the halls, there were it wasn't 50%, it was like 15 or possibly 20%. I mean, a small percentage, but enough so that you saw young women. It was enough to make it seem as though there was no issue. And I know a graduate student from Columbia who went there and said, well, you know, when I was at MSRI, it was wonderful. There was no issue. Now I'm back in Columbia, I feel isolated again, because there really are rather few women mathematicians at Columbia. And I think the numbers make a difference. And I think you have to be very careful how you do these programs. So some programs can have a backlash and can misfire. But when well done, I think it does make a difference. And that it's still important to try, because I think there's a lot of mathematical talent in women that's just not perceived.
Sure.
You know, women, for one thing, they choose to do other things, but
medical.
they also don't feel welcome. They don't feel attracted to. They don't think of mathematics as a welcoming place for them. And actually, for me, you know, one of the advantages of being a mathematician is you don't have a lab. So if you've got a young kid, you actually have very few hours in the day. You have to do something. You know, you can be very, very flexible, which makes it much easier to combine things.
Where does the name Dusa come from? So of course your parents gave you that name.
Well, it comes from Medusa.
Medusa?
I mean, it comes from Medusa.
From
And it comes from my grandmother, who took that name. Well, there's a difference in stories. Whether she took that name for herself as a teenager, she looked at the statue by Bernini of Perseus and Medusa head, and sort of was attracted to the Medusa head. Not quite sure why, but anyway, as a 15-year-old, she had long, snaky black hair, and that may have been part of the reason. But she wanted to be Medusa. And then H.G. Wells called her by that name. So the way I was told about it was a name that H.G. Wells gave to her, and not that she chose it for herself. And that this was, you know, my mother was taken with it and called me this. But the other interesting thing is the image that she had of Medusa is that she's the Gorgon. She's the one who turns everybody to stone. So very powerful, but not a very benign kind of power, so to speak. Apparently in Turkey, Medusa is quite different. She's on Athena's shield, and she's a protecting figure, very powerful, but she's protecting Athena. So she, you know, there's a completely different side to her character. It's not just this horrible Gorgon. But I was brought up with the image that I was called after this horrible Gorgon, which is slightly strange, you know.
I have a daughter who is 2 years old, and she plays mainly with boys who are 4-year-old.
Right.
And what she really wants as gifts are trucks and caterpillars and so on. Is there still a big difference between the way we educate young boys and young girls? And if there is, what is the difference, and what are the consequences of these differences?
Well, I mean, I'm at the moment more aware of what happens in America than in Britain, because I've lived in America for 30 years. In America, you go to Toys R Us, the big toy store, there are aisles of pink and purple stuff, and there are aisles of khaki stuff. I mean, it's unbelievably sex-oriented, everything. And if a girl, you know, if a 5-year-old boy talks to a 5-year-old girl, their boyfriend, girlfriend, and people make jokes about it. I mean, it's immediately, everything that I'm aware of is sex typed. I always try and maintain that girls and boys are the same. But many people really don't believe that. I'm delighted to hear your daughter likes trucks. You may be horrified to find that when she's 6, she wants to be a princess. That's the danger. Because, I mean, in the States, there's this huge princess thing. You know, the idea is to try and make her think she can be a princess and a mathematician. You know, or if she wants to be an engineer, whatever. I mean, you have to work around. There are huge influences in society that make little girls want to do little girl things, and little boys want to do little boy things.
What sense do you give to symplectic topology in inside all mathematics and all sciences, and how is it satisfying for you?
Well, for one thing, I've never tried to justify the mathematics I do in terms of science.
Is mathematics a science?
It's different from a science. It's a mixture
Art and science.
Art and science, I would say. It's a particular human endeavor that I think develops a language which turns out to be a good language for science. But you know, when I think of symplectic geometry and what its applications are, because I learned, the one bit of physics I learned was classical mechanics. There was that has got canonical transformations. That's where symplectic geometry comes from. And that is the language of classical physics. So it's not just quantum physics. It's the basis of understanding flows, conservation of energy. So I would say it's an essential component of the geometry that's related to physics. I mean, obviously Riemannian geometry is related to curvature and space-time relativity, but I think that symplectic geometry is right in there with energy-conserving flows. I mean, it's another essential ingredient. Of course, these days, it does have a very important role to play in string theory and these strange dualities and mirror symmetry and things which relate it to algebraic geometry on the other side. That's very fascinating. I think it's one of the core geometries. You know, there's a theorem of Lie that there are 5 basic kinds of geometries which have sort of irreducible diffeomorphism groups preserving the structure, and there's there's ordinary geometry, then there's there's contact, there's volume preserving, and symplectic. And there's sort of 2 kinds of contact because you can preserve the form or not. But you know, it's just an essential way of doing geometry, I think. And so I think it really does have central importance in mathematics, and therefore, since I think mathematics is a language for science, it mostly has been used in physics. Who knows whether it would be used in biology? I don't know. They may need different mathematics.
When a mathematician sets up a language for let's say for a computer, let's say a bad computer that will be replaced very soon. I mean, very quickly. Then suppose that he sets up a language for that bad computer. Of course, we will say that he invents this language. Okay, we will not say that he discovered something in the universe. To the opposite, if we look at when Maxwell discovered the 4 laws of electromagnetism, then of course we could not say that he invented these laws. We would say that he discovered these laws. So there is a whole spectrum from invention to discovery. Where do you place yourself?
I think that our minds have developed in sort of evolutionary, in living in this world, and therefore the things that we think up actually are often related to the world in ways that we might not expect. So if you're a physicist and you're studying electricity, then presumably how electricity and magnetism behaves is more closely influences the way you think and what you might do than if you're a mathematician just thinking abstractly about the way prime numbers behave. Though you might say that prime numbers are almost as real as electricity, I'm not sure. In a way, I think it's a artificial question whether mathematics is discovered or invented.
No, but even within mathematics, prime numbers are probably something that we could discover, not invent, but somehow they are there. Manifolds also. I mean, once the concept of manifold is there, somehow you think that you're discovering some laws of Riemannian geometry. Right. But when you set up a language for a bad computer, you just invent it.
You invent techniques to solve particular problems. But then, I mean, really, if you're trying to build a subject, then I think. Well, you see, I think that. I think that individual mathematicians, like the imagination of Bill Thurston, had an influence on the way mathematics developed. So I don't think mathematics, what he did was there in the abstract, waiting for somebody to discover it. I think that he had a particular kind of mind which saw certain things and formulated it in a particular way. And then that became part of our language. Then, because, I mean, he had such wonderful ideas and insights, that changed the mathematics landscape. So that's why I say I think invention and discovery, it's a little bit artificial. I think people have individual minds that see things differently, and there are many different kinds of minds that can contribute to mathematics. Actually, that's one thing I'd like to say about Moscow. The Moscow mathematics, which is such a rich mathematical scene. There, many people who in the West would have become historians or artists or whatever, couldn't because of the political situation. They didn't want to get involved with being policed by their thoughts being policed. So they became mathematicians or physicists because that was sort of a freer place. But they had things to contribute. It's not, that people can't do mathematics. If you can... Many different kinds of minds can contribute, I think. Sometimes, very computational, very exact, very quick minds, and sometimes rather slow minds with rather strange ideas, But they can still contribute.
But I was asking the question because I had a few very bright colleagues who thought that what really drives a mathematician is the idea that he or she will discover something, not invent something, just discover something. And so when you do the symplectic topology, and so when, for example, you understand solve a problem about Toric geometry, say for example, you are not driven by the idea that it pre-exists before your findings.
No, that's irrelevant to me. On the other hand, when I found out how ellipsoids, embeddings worked, which was sort of had unexpected relations to number theory and toric geometry, even though it was a very particular sort of simple geometric problem. I would say I didn't invent that. I discovered how it worked. But that was looking at a particular kind of problem within mathematics. And you could see what elements went into analyzing that and understanding the problem.
So we touched the question about mathematics and art. So you were very well influenced by Gelfand's views. He was doing mathematics as one would do poetry in some sense. And you were married to a poet at that moment, by the way. You said just earlier in this interview that mathematics is not exactly a science, but probably a mix of the science and an art. So could you just say a few words about that?
Well, I think it's like an art in the sense that it's divorced from immediate practical content. At least for me it is. I mean, that's the kind of mathematics I do. And so it's driven a lot by aesthetic sense.
Exactly.
I mean, and there's a great sense of beauty. So if you find if you understand how something works, and it can be very messy, but if it's not very messy, there's often a sense of beauty in mathematics. And that's, like when I first saw the multiplication tables, might give people the horrors, but it had a certain symmetry. The numbers had certain relations to each other, which my grandfather explained to me. I thought it was incredibly beautiful. Just to add a little bit more about the idea of discovery and invention, I think that if you're working within a framework that you're trying to understand electricity and magnetism. So that's sort of the framework you're working in. You can discover how it works and find language in which to express that. And another way, it would be a valid way of using that word, is if you're looking at like I was looking at the ellipsoids and I felt I discovered how they behaved, or you're looking at a well-defined question and you discover some counterexamples to a conjecture that people had. But you can discover that because you're working within a framework that you understand.
Yes, for example, of course you need the definition of a manifold, which is based on the definition of a topological space in order to solve problems. And these definitions are absolutely not obvious. I mean, they were.
And that's part of a language that could have been invented, but it turns out to be a very powerful language.
Yeah.
You say that saying that it is a language means somehow that it's a kind of purely formal. It gives the impression that it is simply formal and that it is there is no intuition somehow at the base of mathematics, which is something that I try to teach to my students, that intuition, geometric intuition, for example, is the basic piece of mathematics.
I think there's a huge amount of intuition at the basis of mathematics. Otherwise, we couldn't do mathematics. If they were just abstract, formal symbols that we wouldn't, and we had no idea how they interacted, then we couldn't do mathematics. So I'm not sure I agree with you that.
Just to finish what I had in mind, it's more than a language; it's a set of concepts, and this is exactly what other sciences are looking for. Conceptual framework that is much profound than what they had before.
Well, languages also have concepts. Languages are not just sort of abstract things. Words have meaning associated to them. It's an internal construct of our minds that we've used to try to understand aspects of the world. Mm-hmm. I don't go in much for philosophy, actually. I mean, you may be excited by these philosophical ideas. I'm not so much. So I don't have anything really good to say to you. I mean, when I teach calculus, I've been teaching Calculus 1 this semester for the first time for 15, 20 years or something, and I'm really enjoying it. And I'm trying to teach it as a very, as something that really tells you about the world. It has lots of applications and the statements have meaning. You don't just write down a formula and just manipulate it in some way. You look and see what the formula, what the function is, try and understand it and so on. And the students seem to like that, and they say it gives them a sense of mastery and understanding of the world. Mm-hmm. And you know, that level, that's one level that mathematics can be used at.
It seems that somehow most of the games of children are based somehow, or at least related to deep mathematical questions. How much do you think that these mathematics emerge from these early stages? And once again, what is the difference between boys and girls in this respect?
There are very different things about mathematics that appeal to different people. So for some people, mathematics is a game, and they love that aspect of it. To me, you know, that doesn't appeal to me, and I more prefer to think of it as an art, actually. I mean, I like to think of it like music or abstract painting or something. There are many different ways into mathematics, and as I say, there are many different kinds of minds that have things to contribute in mathematics. I think if you can appeal to young children by giving them sort of mathematically based games and sort of point out or try and show that it does, try and teach mathematics in such a way that it appeals to that side of them, then I think that's definitely a plus. I think you need to teach mathematics in a multifaceted way. So you try and approach people, because people's minds like different things. You know, some people are very systematic. They love to count things. They love to, you know, combinatorialists and people. You know, there's that kind of mind. And then there are other kind of mind who can't do arithmetic for anything. You know, that really turns them off. And what they like are just abstract sorts or spaces or something.
You said that we could use these games that young children play to teach mathematics. But my question was exactly in the reverse direction. That is, I was just not stating, but stating a kind of hypothesis that is the following: perhaps somehow mathematics is a consequence, as a theory, is a consequence of these approach to the world. That is, we as a kid, but of course later in our life, we approach the world in different ways. And when we look at the ways that we approach the world, we understand that there are lots of not only games, but lots of rules and ways to look at it. And somehow mathematics could be an abstraction of these very concrete.
Well, certainly mathematics is an abstraction of very concrete things. I mean, you can say that geometry grew out of the need to measure the fields in the Nile Delta for the tax purposes and that kind of thing. Or to build a pyramid, you need to know. I mean, there's a lot of elementary geometry which is incredibly practical, but you can still, like the Chinese civilization, used mathematics in that very practical way, and it didn't develop a more contemplative kind of abstract mathematics as far as I know. I mean, it was more a lot of examples, and rather than proving that root 2 is irrational. So they might have understood it, but there's certainly no documents to know that they'd formulated that as something. So it's a different kind of philosophical mind, or some slight detachment from the practical world, that builds mathematics, I think. Or the mathematics we know. It is one aspect of the human mind, and it's very developed in the West, but it can be expressed in other societies too, in other ways.
Yes.
So you were asking about the future of symplectic topology.
Yeah.
For one thing, I think that algebraic topology has had a comeback. I mean, what happens to fields is that there's a great flourishing, and then people prove wonderful things, and it gets too complicated, and people give it up for easier things for a while, when it's not being fed by new accessible ideas. But then sometimes there are new problems, there's a new way of looking at things, new ideas coming in, and there have been huge, wonderful advances in algebraic topology recently by Michael Hopkins and other people solving some problems that really hadn't been accessible. So, and that has revived a field. And what revives a field is just a different way of looking at things, new insight, a way of understanding the complications so they become manageable, and instead of having a morass of detail that you have to understand, you can just absorb it in some conceptually easier way. And of course, symplectic geometry has had a huge amount of very talented people contributing great ideas to it, and it sometimes seems as though it's getting to the information overload stage. And in some aspects of it, it is. But we're always hopefully saying, well, you know, it's like the early days of homology theory, when people had all these complicated theories, and somebody will come along and sort of clean it up and make it more accessible again, because you won't have to deal with all these grungy details. And that really may happen. So, I mean, there's still wonderful new approaches, I mean, being fed into symplectic geometry that have, you know, people are honing in. There's this very concrete conjecture about what Lagrangian submanifolds can be close to the nearby Lagrangian conjecture. And people are getting new, really geometric results for that from hugely abstract techniques. So I'm quite hopeful that there is a future for it in this sort of flourishing. And then, you know, it might die away a little bit and then flourish again. Of course, it might not, but it's always hard to say. It might just get absorbed into other ways of looking at problems.
You have been associated to MSRI since 1992 or more or less, so that's 20 years. So you were first on the scientific committee, and then chair of that scientific committee, and then on the board also. So could you explain this? I mean, I think it was an exciting period because...
Well, I've always found MSRI an incredibly exciting place to be involved with. I mean, partly because being on the East Coast, you go to this fabulous place overlooking the bay, and it's sunny and it's warm, and it's just a different environment. But also, there's a real excitement about mathematics there. All the sort of grungy everyday details that you have to deal with as a faculty member, they're not there anymore. And you can think about the future and the sort of how to make progress. And then I came at a very exciting time, because I think when I came was very soon after Bill Thurston had come as director, and he had a lot of wonderful ideas about how, you know, about mathematics as a community, about the importance of education, about how to build mathematical communities, and just a whole set of ideas about how the Institute could function and really function in the mathematical scene in America. And also the Scientific Advisory Committee is a really nice committee to be on because you actually make decisions and they have an effect. You know, most committees you're on, you read papers and you talk and this and that and nothing happens. But MSRI, you know, you decide what the programs are, you decide what the people are. You can talk to the administration if you'd like a certain, you know, more of a certain kind of person to be invited. So it's a really rewarding committee to be on. When I was chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee, other people had a lot of good ideas for programs. I don't think I designed a program. On the other hand, I enjoyed sort of coordinating the viewpoints, and it was also an opportunity to try and promote women and just promote a sort of a variety of different kinds of mathematics. So I've always enjoyed that. And then I was chair of the board, and that was a time, I remember just before I became chair, it was a time when we started fundraising, which was a real shock to people in the mathematical community, because you know, one of the attractions of doing mathematics is you don't have to be worried about money. And here we had this development director. This was actually, I think even Bill Thurston had started trying to, you know, get money. We were just baby steps of how you could possibly approach these bankers and people and ask for money. You know, that's such a difficult thing to do. NSF supported MSRI. And, well, there were places like the Institute, they'd already got their endowment. You know, people weren't so actively, as far as I was aware, raising money, because I was, after all, at a state university. The state provided the money. I came from Britain, where the state at that time provided all money for academia. I was not used to the idea of fundraising, and I can tell you that most of the mathematicians at MSRI were not used to the idea of fundraising either. But we had some amazing people on the board who were, you know, in the world of finance or venture capitalists, or they kept trying to educate us about how you have to have a mission statement, you had to have financial plans, you had to how to present yourself, what kind of tie the director should wear. I mean, just all kinds of things, which I never felt. I mean, I never had to do any of that really myself. But I certainly encouraged it because it seemed very necessary. And you also needed good ideas about, you know, how to make mathematics interesting to a community like that. And people were willing to come up with ideas of that kind. And it wasn't so hard because quite a few of the bankers had mathematical backgrounds. So some of them even had a fondness for it, so you could appeal to that. So it was sort of interesting being involved in a very different world.